After our study of the subject of Maya, in our last class we were faced with the question of how that Maya or avidya is removed. The simple, straightforward answer is avidya is removed by its opposite, vidya or jnana. Avidya, as we saw, consists in our imagining that we are separate individuals. All our suffering is due to this false notion. So, in order to get rid of avidya, the individual soul, the jivatman, has to learn to transcend its individuality. How is that done? That led us to the well-known method of Vedanta, a method by which a spiritual seeker discovers the truth about oneself. As we heard last week, it's a twofold method. The first part is known as superimposition or adhyasa, and the second part is known as negation, apavada. Superimposition of what? Of the so-called limiting agents, factors that limit or seem to limit the limitless, upadhis. And negation of that superimposition, that is apavada. In the course of our discussions, we learned about the three bodies and the 5 sheaths, 3 shariras and 5 koshas. If we leave out the gross body or the sheath of food, we see that a living being, and especially a human being, has 3 main characteristics: knowledge, will, and action. In psychology, it is called cognition, volition, and operation. The power of knowledge, the ability, the faculty of knowing, is a quality of the manomaya kosha or intelligent sheath. The power of will through which an action is performed is the quality of the mental sheath. The first one is vijnanamaya kosha, the power of knowledge. That is the quality of the vijnanamaya kosha. The power of will through which an action is performed, that is the quality of the manomaya kosha. But then, no action is possible without vitality, without energy, and this power of operation, that is the quality of the vital sheath, pranamaya kosha. So when pure consciousness is limited by these 3 sheaths, it is said to become endowed. It is said to become endowed with knowledge, will, and activity. So the division is made according to the respective properties of the 3 sheaths. And these 3 sheaths together make up the subtle body, which doesn't die with the death of the gross body, but accompanies the soul in its transmigration. These 3 together, the pranamaya kosha, the manomaya kosha, and the vijnanamaya kosha. These 3 together make up our sukshma sharira. Now comes the last sheath, the anandamaya kosha. This sheath of bliss is even subtler than the sheath of the intellect, than the vijnanamaya kosha. And the main qualities, the main features of this kosha are joy and rest, peace. The joy that we experience when we come in contact with, say, a delightful object, and the rest that we experience in sleep. These are the main characteristics of the Anandamaya Kosha. In the waking state, Ananda or bliss, it is usually experienced when we are intensely absorbed in higher things. In higher things, say art, science, philosophy. When we are in a condition of near total self-forgetfulness. It is also felt as a feeling of satisfaction, fulfillment. It is felt as an inner peace that we experience as the result of a good action. Good dharmic people are said to feel this ananda, this higher ananda, without the least effort when their past good karmas bear fruit. That is why we see that these dharmic people are cheerful almost by nature. Even when they suffer, they seem to suffer cheerfully. Still, even this kind of bliss, this superior bliss, is caused by external forces, external factors. And so, this is also subject to change. These are partial manifestations of bliss known in the waking state. Or in the dream state, we experience them, this bliss, due to pleasant memory impressions. But the full functioning of this Anandamaya Kosha, that is felt only in dreamless deep sleep, when we remain totally unconscious of suffering of any kind. And for that matter, unconscious of happiness of any kind also. It's a state, deep sleep happens to be a state from which we awake with a feeling of happiness and relaxation. So the Anandamaya Kosha is closest to the self, but still it is not the self. We must not confuse this bliss, with the bliss of the Atman or Brahman, because even this, the bliss of Anandamaya Kosha, is also a product, a modification of Maya or ignorance. Ignorance, not knowing, unknowing, this ignorance persists even in deep sleep. But how do we know that? How do we know that we don't know anything? Because the Atman, the real self, is ever conscious. It is consciousness itself. But the person in deep sleep is aware neither of oneself nor of the outside world. When I wake up, I say, I slept happily. I didn't know anything. So, what does this indicate? This is the experience of the unconsciousness of dreamless sleep. When I wake up, I come to know that I did not know anything. So the memory of unconsciousness remains. So from the sheath of bliss, we return to the outside world without any change of nature. Because we go into ignorance and come out of ignorance. But the knowledge of Brahman brings about a total transformation of character. That is the big difference between deep sleep and samadhi. Anyhow, this fifth and last sheath is said to be our causal body. Now we can continue with our discussion of the twofold method of adhyasa and apavada. In the first part, superimposition, we saw how, because of ignorance, one thing is perceived as another, and the properties of the one are attributed to the other. Now we take up the second part, negation. We will see how, with the help of discrimination, viveka, the falsely superimposed attributes are eliminated and the true nature of the thing is discovered. We were talking about the gross, subtle and causal aspects of the individualized soul, Jivatma, the 3 bodies and the 5 sheaths. As we have learnt, all of them are only modifications of matter, primal matter, Prakriti. So they are unreal in themselves. They don't possess absolute reality. They appear to be real because the self, the Atman, is their substratum, their underlying basis. Just as a mirage appears to be real because the desert happens to be its substratum. The point is, without an underlying basis that is real, there can be no appearance. At the same time, appearance is not reality. I repeat, without an underlying basis that is real, there can be no appearance. But appearance is not reality. So these bodies and sheaths are not real coverings on the Atman. The Atman, the self, is infinite and eternal. They only look real. I mean the 3 bodies and the 5 sheaths, they only look real when the self underlying them is not seen. It is the light of the self, the Atman, that shows through all of them in varying degrees according to their composition, according to their density. But when we stop identifying ourselves with these modifications of matter, when we are no longer ignorant, then the full glory of the Atman, that is unobstructed by any of them, and it stands revealed. And just this is the aim of Vedanta, to help us recover our forgotten identity. Our everyday life is lived almost wholly on the physical and mental planes. Our experiences are confined to objects and ideas. Our sense of self is limited by factors like the body, sense organs, the mind, or ego. So these things virtually make up our average existence, and so we doubt the reality of anything beyond because we don't see that. But as long as we equate ourselves with these things, we cannot perceive anything subtler. In our daily practical life, we only deal with shadows, so to say. It is these shadows that Vedanta asks us to negate. Vedanta says the individualization of the Atman, the self, is not real. It's an illusion created by ignorance. The self is unattached. It cannot be related to the objective world except through delusion, false ideas. Delusion is Täuschung oder Irrtum. So, the self, the Atman, cannot be related to this world or anything of it except through this delusion. And because the very idea of individuality is a product of delusion, it ceases to exist when the delusion is destroyed. The idea of individuality ceases to exist when delusion is destroyed. How? As I said, by vidya, by true knowledge of the self. Because of ignorance, a rope appears to be a snake, and it continues to be perceived as a snake as long as the ignorance lasts. But when the true nature of the rope is seen, then the idea of snake disappears. When ignorance is destroyed by right knowledge, all notions, all ideas of the self's individuality cease to exist. Just as the dream ego, which functions in sleep, which is real in sleep, vanishes when the dreamer awakes to the real world. So, the Atman is the only existing reality. It cannot by any means become individualized, because the idea of individuality does not exist from the standpoint of the Atman. There can't be any real connection. There can't be any real connection between the Atman and its apparent individuality. Just as there can't be any point of contact between the desert and the mirage. The water of a mirage is illusory. It can't soak a single grain of sand in the desert. So now, what happens when the threefold body, the fivefold sheath, and all objects and ideas are negated as unreal? What happens then? It may be argued that when the process of negation is carried to its final point, to its logical conclusion, one finds an utter absence, an absolute absence of everything. So what remains is a void, nothingness. That means the ultimate reality is a void or non-existence. This is what one school of Buddhist, this is how one school of Buddhist philosophers in fact concluded. But Vedantic logic goes further. Vedanta points out that every act of negation leaves behind a positive residuum. It leaves behind something, a remainder. When the snake is negated, the rope remains. And when the rope is negated, something else remains. Please think about it. It is not nothingness. Something does remain. In the end, after all the changing superimpositions have been removed, what remains is not void, but pure being. Existence itself, not the existence of this or that, but existence itself. When all objects and ideas have disappeared, what stands in their place is not emptiness. It is pure consciousness. Not the consciousness of this or that object. Consciousness itself. The perceiver of the void, this consciousness is the perceiver of the void, the emptiness. And that is the real self, the Atman. As a matter of fact, Vedanta holds that only after this kind of relentless negation, one can realize the pure, attributeless self, the witness of all modifications, modifications of relativity. Not only that, not only the witness of modifications, it is also the witness of their absence. This is how far Vedantic logic goes. The self is also the witness of the absence of modifications. So it could be called contentless consciousness, in which both subject and object merge and disappear. It can't be a void. It can't be a void for one final reason, and that is experience. A person emerging from the experience of the Atman is full of knowledge and wisdom. Please listen carefully, because this is something that is based on reason. This is the final proof that the self is not nothingness. It is not something negative. A person coming out of the experience of the Atman is full of knowledge and wisdom, full of peace and blessedness, love and compassion. So this self, this real self, is the individualized souls, the Jivatma's real essence. When the soul discovers this, it discards all limitations and realizes its own true nature. It is just as a river entering the ocean gives up name and form and finds its real source, its not only its source, its ultimate goal. A river re-entering the ocean, giving up name and form and finding its real source and ultimate goal. So, the Atman is not void. It is not nothingness. Now, what is the process by which one recovers this real identity? According to Vedanta, the true nature of the self is discovered through the method of negation, apavada, a method in which one systematically refutes all phenomena, all names and forms as illusory until one arrives at self-knowledge or Brahman knowledge. Vedanta says, just as a snake seen in a rope is in the end, that is to say, after proper investigation, when the process of neti is carried to its ultimate state, at that point, it is found to be nothing but the rope. In the same way, the unreal individuality that is superimposed on the real self, the Atman, that is realized in the end to be nothing but the self. Before proceeding any further, we must be clear about what exactly negation means. Otherwise, there will be much unnecessary misunderstanding. I repeat, it is not the relative reality of our present personality that is denied. That reality, being based on the real self, does surely exist, though only for the time being. What is actually negated is this wrong idea, the idea springing from ignorance that this personality of name and form is absolutely real in itself, that is, independent of the Atman. That idea, that wrong idea, is what is denied. Now we can move on to a more detailed description of apavada, or the method of negation. As you know, There are two great Vedic statements by contemplating which the mind is led from this false personality of name and form to the self that underlies them. There are 4 Mahavakyas, but these two are the most important. I repeat, through the contemplation of these statements, the mind is led from our false individual self to the real self that underlies that apparent individuality. Tattvamasi and Aham Brahmasmi. That thou art, and I am Brahman. Both these statements point to the same fact, and that fact is the ultimate and essential oneness of the individual soul and God, the universal soul. The ultimate and essential oneness of the Jiva and Ishvara, because the reality behind both of them is Brahman, pure consciousness. This has to be understood properly. The identity, not directly of the Jiva and the Parabrahman, not of the Jivatman and the Paramatman, but Jivatma and Ishvara, the individual soul and the universal soul. Because the reality, the essence of both of them is Brahman, pure consciousness. Let's try to understand the meaning of the first statement, Tattvamasi, that thou art. The word that has 2 meanings. Now we are going to some philosophy. The word that has 2 meanings, a direct or let us say the literal meaning and an implied meaning. Literally, that stands for the conditioned Brahman, Ishvara, who is associated with the universe as its creator, preserver, and destroyer, and who is endowed with omniscience, omnipotence, lordship, and such other attributes, plus pure consciousness, which underlies both the conditioned Brahman and the universe. I'll repeat. That, Tat, stands for the conditioned Brahman, Saguna Brahman, who is the creator, preserver, and destroyer of the universe, plus pure consciousness, which underlies both Ishvara and the Jagat, the universe. That is to say, the direct meaning of Tat is the conditioned Brahman, Brahman with attributes, God, the universal soul. But the implied meaning of that is pure consciousness unassociated with any limiting factor of Maya, which happens to be the substratum not only of God but also of the universe. In the same way, the word thou, you, that also has 2 meanings, a literal meaning and an implied meaning. Directly, you stands for the individualized soul, which is associated with an individual body, characterized by limitations like birth, death, hunger, thirst, pain, pleasure, which is endowed with limited knowledge, limited power, limited freedom, everything limited. Plus, in the same way, pure consciousness, which underlies all this, That is to say, the direct meaning of you is the individual soul, the human being. But the implied meaning of you is pure consciousness, which is not associated with any limiting factor of Maya, and which also happens to be the substratum of the individual soul. And the word are, you are that thou art. The word art in the statement, that conveys the idea of the identity of that and thou. That is the connection. So what do we mean, what do we do when the direct meaning of a statement does not agree with actual fact? What do we do when the literal meaning of a statement doesn't agree with actual fact? Then we have to interpret in terms of its implied meaning. It is obvious that and thou are characterized by contradictory attributes. They are not the same. They cannot be identical from the standpoint of the literal meanings. That is to say, Ishvara differs from the Jiva. The Jiva and Ishvara are not the same as they appear. Ishvara differs from the Jiva as the sun from a firefly, the ocean from a well, or a mountain from a mustard seed. We heard this long ago when we were discussing the subject of Saguna Brahman. So that is the vast difference between the Jiva and the Ishvara. But still, their identity is a fact. It is a fact that is realized through direct and immediate experience of the rishis. That is the fact. So, this identity of such dissimilar beings, this is explained from the standpoint of the implied meaning. Vedanta philosophers, they reason that the contrasting attributes, the conflicting things which distinguish Ishvara and Jiva are not ultimately real. They are only for the time being, and they are the result of adhyasa, superimposition, jivatva and shivatva, shivahood and jivahood. These are superimpositions. It is through ignorance that pure consciousness appears to have become God and the universe. And through ignorance, again, the same pure consciousness appears to have become the Jiva, having a separate individual body. The superimpositions are all illusory. Their basis, their substratum, that alone is real. It is pure consciousness alone that is the substratum of both Ishvara and Jiva. When the false superimpositions are all eliminated through neti, through apavada, negation, one realizes by direct experience that the ultimate reality is pure consciousness. The ultimate reality is neither God nor the individual soul, neither Ishvara nor Jiva. It is consciousness itself, non-dual. There's a particular method which Vedanta philosophers use to get at the implied meaning of a statement. How to arrive at that? They have a special method by which that implied meaning is obtained. It is by eliminating the conflicting aspects of the two major words of a statement. By eliminating the contrary aspects of the two major words, that and thou. Let me give an illustration. On seeing a man named Mr. X, say Mr. X, on seeing a man named Mr. X after a long time, his friend exclaims in surprise, "This is that Mr. X." Now, obviously, the Mr. X seen a long time ago and probably at another place, that Mr. X cannot be the one seen here and now. That Mr. X cannot be literally this Mr. X. There's a conflict in both time and space, time and place. But still, there is this fact of recognition. It is something that is actually experienced and it cannot be denied. This is possible because the conflicting elements, the time and place, which vary, the time and place are ignored and the attention is focused on the man himself. Now you get the point. In the same way, in interpreting the sentence, Tat Tvamasi, that thou art, the sadhaka gives up the contradictory elements associated with that and thou. That is, the notions, the ideas of creator and creature, and recognizes their oneness from where? From the standpoint of the absolute, from the standpoint of pure consciousness, which happens to be the basis, the essence of both. This is the method of negation, apavada. After explaining the meaning of this great Vedic statement, the teacher, the guru, encourages his disciple to meditate on his real essence. You find these about 10 verses which are actually used for meditation in Viveka Chudamani, Shankaracharya's Viveka Chudamani. There is this set of 10 verses. That which is beyond caste and creed, family and lineage, which is without name and form, merit and demerit, that which transcends space and time and sense objects. You are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. That which is free from birth, growth, maturity, decline, infirmity and death. That which is indestructible. That which is the cause of the projection, maintenance and dissolution of the universe. You are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. That which is free from duality, that which is infinite, supreme, eternal, undying, that which is taintless. You are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. That beyond which there is nothing, which shines above Maya and is infinitely greater than the universe, the inmost self of all, the one without a second, existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute, infinite and changeless. You are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. These verses are so very reminiscent of Shankaracharya's Nirvana Shatka. So when the disciple hears these lofty teachings, he begins to reflect on their meaning. He exercises. He doesn't just keep repeating it. He exercises his reason on the Guru's teaching and slowly realizes that the teacher's words are true. True in the sense they are reasonable. They don't contradict reason. Then he meditates on Brahman with unshakable conviction, because his intellect is convinced. Then he meditates with faith and single-minded devotion. And in this way, he gradually rids himself of all superimpositions, due to which he had identified himself with all these impermanent, fleeting things, due to which he had clung to notions of I, me, and mine. First thing is, what happens now is, he stops paying undue attention to the physical body. This is the first effect. Then he purifies himself by constant reflection and contemplation. And finally, he discovers the pure self which had lain covered by impurities all this time. And what is that impurity? That impurity is nothing but our endless desires. The more our mind is established in the real self, the less it is attached to the outside world. And of course, vice versa. And when all desires have been totally eliminated, then there takes place this uninterrupted vision of the self. But then, this discipline of negation, this is a spiritual discipline actually. There is nothing intellectual about it. This must be practiced ceaselessly. How long? Vedanta teachers say, as long as even a shadowy perception, of the phenomenal universe, the world outside, and the finite soul, as long as these ideas remain, as long as identification with the body is not completely wiped out, attachment to the world outside or identification with the ego inside, neither should be given the slightest chance to make one forget the real nature of one's true self. Shankaracharya goes to this extent because Maya is extremely powerful. It must never be forgotten that it is this ego that aggravates our desires. It is this ego with its desires that brings the self, the Atman, back again and again to the world of ignorance. So, this is how the seeker learns the precise meaning, the implied meaning of the statement Tattvamasi, rejecting attributes wrongly superimposed on Tat and Tvam, that and thou. One understands that the statement refers to the absolute oneness of the individual self and the supreme self. It is experienced on the plane of pure consciousness. And as one meditates on one's unity with Brahman, it is said that there arises in the mind a state, a wave. It is also called a vritti, because the mind is still alive. There arises a state, a vritti, which makes the meditator feel that one is, in fact, the self-luminous Brahman, because the mind has become extremely pure. This mental state is said to be illumined by the reflection of pure consciousness. And this highly, extremely pure mental wave gradually destroys the sadhaka's ignorance, their doubts regarding Brahman. But even now, even now, Brahman is only a state, a wave, it is only a vritti of the mind. When that ignorance is completely destroyed, together with its effects, that is, the various mental states, however subtle they are also destroyed. It is like when we say a piece of cloth is burnt, it implies that the warp and woof, the Kette und Schluss that made the cloth, they are also burnt. So, when ignorance, avidya, is destroyed, the mental state, the vritti that is colored by Brahman, which is also a part of the effects of Maya, even if it carries this reflection of Brahman, even then, because it is a wave, there is still duality. But when that is destroyed, then ignorance is totally destroyed. When this last mental state or wave, this vritti, when that is destroyed, what happens exactly? It is not that everything vanishes into nothingness. There remains only the consciousness that was reflected in it. The form has gone, but the thing in itself remains. That is why it is said, there remains only the consciousness that was reflected in that vritti, that last vritti. Vedanta philosophers say this tiny bit of consciousness, it's a way of saying, expressing the inexpressible. They say this tiny bit of consciousness, being unable to illumine the supreme self-luminous Brahman, becomes overpowered by it. That is to say, Brahman just swallows this last vritti. When that final mental vritti is destroyed, the tiny bit of consciousness reverts to Brahman. That is how they describe it. Actually, this state, if at all it can be called a state, this is beyond description. It is like the image of a face in a mirror, reverting to the face itself when the mirror is removed. It is like the reflection of the sun in a dish of water. What happens when the dish is removed? All that can be said is the reflection has reverted to the sun. So what happens is, when meditation deepens into samadhi, then the mind is after all an effect of ignorance. It's a product of Maya, a form of matter. In samadhi, in the final stage of samadhi, that mind is also destroyed, and in the absence of the reflecting medium, the mind or the vritti had been the reflecting medium of Brahman. But when that itself is destroyed, the Brahman that was reflected in that mind gets absorbed into the supreme Brahman, which now shines alone, non-dual, ekameva dvitiyam. This is how the subject and the object, pure consciousness and the perceiving, individualized consciousness, this is how they become one. When the duality is removed, there remains only the supreme Brahman, the one without a second. Sri Ramakrishna says, such an experience is not possible as long as you are conscious of your ego. So that is the qualification for aspirants of Advaita. Sri Ramakrishna says, a man realizes Brahman only when he feels neither I nor you, neither one nor many. Think of the sun and of 10 jars filled with water. The sun is reflected in each jar. At first, you see one real sun and 10 reflected suns. If you break 9 of the jars, then there will remain only one real sun and one reflection. Each jar represents a jiva. Following the reflection, one can find the real sun. So that reflection is necessary. Through the individual soul, one can reach the Supreme Soul. Through spiritual discipline, the individual soul can get the vision of the Supreme Soul. What Sri Ramakrishna says, what remains when the last jar is broken, that cannot be described. In another place in the Gospel, he explains it even more clearly. There he says, one attains Brahmajnana as soon as one's mind is annihilated, destroyed. With the annihilation of the mind, the ego dies. The ego which says, I. Sri Ramakrishna says, one also attains the knowledge of Brahman by following the path of devotion, where also, after lifelong self-surrender, practice of self-surrender, the I dies. Sri Ramakrishna says, one also attains the knowledge of Brahman by following the path of devotion. One also attains it by following the path of jnana, that is to say, viveka. The jnanis discriminate, saying, neti, neti. All this is illusory, like a dream. They analyze the world through the process of not this. It is all maya. When the world vanishes, only the jivas, that is to say, so many egos remain. First, in the beginning stages of samadhi, the outside world vanishes, but the ego still remains. Each ego, Sri Ramakrishna says, each ego is like a pot. Suppose there are 10 pots filled with water and the sun is reflected in them. How many suns do you see? A devotee says, 10 reflections plus, surely there exists the real sun. Then Sri Ramakrishna asks, suppose you break one pot, how many suns do you see now? 9 reflected suns. But still, the real sun exists. All right. Suppose you break 9 pots, how many suns do you see now? 1 reflected sun. But there surely exists the real sun. Then Sri Ramakrishna asks, what remains when the last pot is broken? What remains when the last pot is broken? The devotee says, the real sun, sir. No. Sri Ramakrishna says, no. What remains cannot be described. What is remains. That is the whole point. How will you know there is a real sun unless there is a reflected sun? I consciousness is destroyed in samadhi. But until then, we need this I consciousness because that is the indication of the Supreme Brahman. A person climbing down from samadhi, Sri Ramakrishna says, a person climbing down from samadhi to the lower plane cannot describe what he has seen on that plane. So, this is how the knowledge of Brahman thoroughly destroys all false superimpositions which accounted for the seeker's individuality. Realizing within oneself the infinite and eternal Brahman, which is Nitya Shuddha, Nitya Buddha, Nitya Mukta, ever pure, ever illumined, ever free, the seeker is liberated forever. Liberated from what? Liberated from ignorance and delusion, fear, grief, death. Not only that, one becomes the embodiment of supreme bliss. He becomes Ananda itself. This is the state where one says, I am Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi. The teacher had said, that thou art, and now the seeker confirms it, I am Brahman. But this ultimate experience is utterly indescribable in words. It is known only to one who has attained it. So, the understanding of the precise meaning of the statement, Tattvamasi, is a transcendental experience. That is why Ramana Maharshi said, who is it that says Aham Brahmasmi? It is Brahman that says Aham Brahmasmi. It is not the ego. So it's a transcendental experience felt on the spiritual plane. The meaning cannot be realized if the seeker has the slightest attachment to material things. Things like the body, mind, or ego, or even to sensations associated with them. The knowledge, the joy, the freedom which result from this mystic experience are entirely different from what we experience, from the counterparts of those of that joy and freedom that we experience on the relative plane, in the world of time and space and causality. When one realizes that absolute identity of Tat and Tvam, one knows the true meaning of religion. This is what Swamiji said, Swami Vivekananda. Swamiji famously said, religion is realization. Until you have arrived there, you are still a mere intellectual. You are not spiritual. You are trying to be spiritual. That is why Swami Vivekananda said, religion is realization, nothing short of it. Realization of the eternal oneness of the eternal God and the eternal soul. Realization of the eternal oneness of the eternal God and the eternal soul.